There is a hole in the top of a mountain in southern Russia that does not appear on any archaeological map. No university has surveyed it. No government agency has funded an expedition to it. And yet, if the handful of people who have climbed down into it are telling the truth, it may be one of the strangest built spaces ever found on the planet, a shaft that drops the height of a 30-story building into solid rock, lined with stone blocks too heavy to move with any equipment its builders could have possessed, leading to a hall the size of a cathedral that no human being appears to have ever lived in, worked in, or worshipped in. It has no name in any textbook. It barely has a name at all. Locals call it the Kahora shaft after the peak it sits beneath, and almost nobody outside a small circle of Russian cave explorers has ever heard of it. This is the story of how it was found, why it shouldn't be possible, and why the people who looked into it the hardest kept running into dead ends, some of them disturbingly literal. The shaft was not discovered by an archaeologist. It was found by a speleologist, a cave scientist, who had spent years doing something most of his colleagues considered a waste of time, taking local legends seriously. In the villages scattered through the Kabardino-Balkarian mountains of the North Caucasus, elders had long told stories of stone corridors buried inside the peaks, passageways too straight and too smooth to have formed on their own, and of ancestors who were said to have lived, at least for a time, beneath the mountains rather than on top of them. Most researchers filed these tales alongside every other piece of regional folklore, colorful, but not evidence of anything. The man who eventually found the shaft treated the stories differently. He cross-referenced them against old wartime maps and expedition notes left behind by German units that had passed through the region decades earlier, looking for a pattern in where the old stories clustered most densely. Eventually, the pattern pointed him to a single, unremarkable-looking crack in the rock near the summit of Kahora Peak. In 2011, he and a small team roped in and went down to see what was actually there. What they found took over an hour to reach. The shaft is narrow enough that a climber's shoulders brush the walls on both sides for most of the descent, and the air turns noticeably colder the deeper the rope runs. Then, without warning, the passage opens into an enormous chamber, an underground hall with a ceiling reported to tower more than 30 meters overhead, roughly the height of a 12-story building, carved or built into the heart of the mountain. The walls of that hall are not raw stone. They are lined, floor to ceiling, with massive rectangular blocks fitted together with joints so tight that a headlamp beam barely catches the seams. Branching away from the main chamber are dozens of narrower passages, some barely wide enough for an arm, disappearing into total darkness in every direction the team pointed their lights. And rising up out of that darkness, felt more than heard, was a slow, steady current of cold air, moving air that had to be coming from somewhere much further down, somewhere none of the ropes they carried could reach. The scale of the stonework is the detail that stops most people cold. Explorers who examined the shaft estimated that some of the largest blocks lining its walls weigh as much as 200 tons. For comparison, the enormous granite roofing beams inside the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid of Giza, long considered one of the most impressive lifting feats of the ancient world, weigh roughly 80 tons each. The stones inside this Caucasus mountain are, by that estimate, more than double that weight, sitting at high altitude with no quarry nearby, no access road, and no flat ground on which anyone could have positioned a crane, ancient or modern. Skeptics are right to point out that ancient people simply moved huge stones is not, by itself, an explanation. It's a phrase that hides an enormous unanswered question. But it's also true that humanity has done this before, on an even larger scale, and left behind almost no record of how. At Baalbek in modern Lebanon, 3 colossal cut stones, known as the trilithon blocks, sit beneath the ruins of the Roman Temple of Jupiter. Each is over 19 meters long and weighs an estimated 900 tons, roughly 10 times heavier than the largest stones of the Great Pyramid, and they were somehow quarried, transported more than half a kilometer, and raised 9 meters into position atop other 400-ton blocks. Nearby, still sitting in the quarry, is an even larger unfinished monolith known as the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, and beneath that, discovered by German archaeologists in 2014, an even bigger block dubbed the Forgotten Stone, estimated at over 1,600 tons, the largest quarried stone block ever documented anywhere on Earth. Rome kept meticulous records of its major construction projects. It kept none of this. Whatever method placed those stones has simply vanished from the historical record. That is the real significance of Baalbek for a site like Kahora. It proves the physical feat was achievable by human hands at some point in the deep past. It also proves that the knowledge of how it was done can disappear completely, leaving future generations staring at the results with no explanation at all. Normally, when archaeologists walk into an ancient structure, the site tells them what it was for. Tombs contain the dead. Temples contain altars, soot from ritual fires and offerings. Mines are scarred with the marks of extraction and littered with discarded rubble. Every one of these uses leaves physical evidence behind, which is exactly how researchers usually reconstruct the purpose of a space centuries or millennia later. The Kahora shaft has none of that. There are no stairs, no handholds, no ladder niches cut into the rock, nothing that would have allowed a person to climb in or out without modern climbing rope, which means whoever built it, if it was built, apparently had no way of returning to it by the route that exists today. There is no soot staining the walls, which matters more than it might sound. Anyone moving through an underground space with a torch or oil lamp leaves a carbon signature on stone that survives for thousands of years. Its absence suggests the chamber was either never lit by fire or was sealed before any human ever carried a flame through it. There are no carvings, no inscriptions, no pottery shards, no bones, no tools. Nothing that identifies who was here, when, or why. It is, in the words of one Russian researcher who later examined available footage of the site, a space that seems to share more in common with the unexplained shafts found deep inside the Egyptian pyramid complex. Narrow, precisely cut passages that lead nowhere anyone can identify a use for, than with any ordinary cave or tomb. Both sets of structures show the same absence of human residue and the same total absence of any evidence for what they were actually built to do. Before going further, the geological explanation deserves to be taken seriously because it isn't a weak argument. Kahora Peak sits on volcanic rock and volcanic tuff, the compressed ash and fused rock fragments left behind by eruptions, genuinely can fracture into strange, regular-looking shapes. Cooling volcanic rock famously forms tall hexagonal columns at sites like the Giant's Causeway in Ireland, formations so geometrically clean that early travelers assumed they had to be artificial. Nature really can imitate architecture. But natural fracture patterns have a signature of their own, and it is a different signature than what explorers reported inside Kahora. Cooling basalt and tuff split into columns with 5 or 6 sides, the geometry of a crystalline cooling pattern, not a builder's right angle. Natural fractures also wander. They curve, bow, and drift as the crack travels through uneven material, and they're laced with smaller diagonal cracks running off in every direction. The walls of the Kahora shaft, by contrast, are reported to run straight and parallel for tens of meters without deviation, meeting each other at consistent right angles, with none of the diagonal fissuring that shows up in every naturally fractured tuff formation anywhere else in the world. Explorers also described a fine material packed into the seams between blocks, resembling mortar, something no known volcanic or geological process produces on its own. Taken together, the team that surveyed the site concluded they could not find a comparable natural cave formation anywhere in the geological literature. That doesn't prove intent, but it does shift the honest question away from, is this natural or artificial, and toward a harder one. If it is artificial, who built it, when and why go to this much effort for space no one could apparently ever use again? Part of what makes Kahora easy to dismiss is that it can be made to sound like an isolated anomaly, a single strange hole with no context. But the North Caucasus is one of the most continuously worked landscapes in the ancient world, and the deeper you look, the less isolated the shaft appears. Roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, a Bronze Age culture rose in the northern foothills of this same mountain range, working gold, silver, and arsenical bronze, and building large burial mounds. Their stone burial chambers connect directly to the wider dolmen tradition of the region, and across the western Caucasus today, thousands of dolmens still stand, dressed stone chambers fitted at clean right angles, some with perfectly circular holes bored straight through solid rock faces. Travel further south into Georgia, and an entire settlement was carved directly into a cliff at Uplas, inhabited continuously for centuries. Elsewhere in the same republic that holds Kahora, a remote gorge holds a cluster of stone tombs locals still call the City of the Dead. Across thousands of years, the people of these mountains have repeatedly answered their landscape by cutting into stone. And if the question is how far back genuine large-scale stoneworking skill can be pushed, the answer keeps moving. At Göbekli Tepe and nearby Karahan Tepe in southern Turkey, hunter-gatherers with no agriculture, no writing, and no wheels raised massive carved stone pillars more than 11,000 years ago, the oldest monumental architecture known anywhere on Earth, and something an entire generation of archaeologists insisted couldn't have existed at that stage of human development, until it was dug out of the ground. Underground engineering on a large scale isn't unusual in this broader region either. The underground city of Derinkuyu in Cappadocia descends dozens of meters through multiple levels of ventilated rooms. The Longyu caverns in China were cut by hand more than 2,000 years ago, with no surviving record of who made them. The hypogeum on Malta was carved 3 stories into bedrock to mirror temples built above ground. None of this requires a single vanished global civilization. It requires something almost stranger, that across cultures who never met, humans repeatedly chose to build downward, into the dark, for reasons that don't always survive in the record. Part of what makes Kahora unsettling is who else appears to have gone looking for it before it was discovered. During the Second World War, German forces pushed into the Caucasus as part of a campaign aimed at seizing Soviet oil fields. Traveling alongside the military was a research wing of the SS, known as the Unnerb, an organization publicly devoted to studying Aryan heritage but which, in practice, sent expeditions around the world hunting for physical evidence of lost ancient civilizations, including a well-documented 1938-39 mission to Tibet chasing legends of a hidden underground kingdom said to hold advanced ancient knowledge. The Caucasus, with its own deep folklore of vanished underground builders, appears to have drawn the same attention. A swastika is carved into a boulder near the summit above the shaft, evidence, at minimum, that German researchers reached the site and considered it significant. Oddly, a second, much older swastika-like symbol was also found nearby, unconnected to the wartime carving. The symbol itself predates Nazi use by thousands of years across Eurasian cultures, but its presence alongside the wartime marking raises an uncomfortable question nobody has answered. Were German researchers following a trail someone else had marked long before them? The modern investigation into the shaft has its own dark postscript. The speleologist who first went down in 2011 died in a traffic accident in 2015, reportedly the day after mentioning a significant new find related to the site. The researcher, who led the follow-up survey and produced the first documentary footage of the shaft, died of illness a few years later. Several others connected to the early expeditions have since died as well. None of this constitutes evidence of foul play, and it would be irresponsible to claim otherwise without proof, but it is also fair to say that the people who knew the most about Kahora are no longer here to tell anyone what they found, and nobody has picked up the thread since. The frustrating part of this entire story is how solvable it actually is. A thin sample of the wall surface, examined under a microscope, would tell a geologist within days whether it was cut by a tool or shaped by natural cooling. The material packed into the seams could be chemically tested to confirm whether it's genuine mortar or a natural mineral deposit. A modern survey using proper equipment could finally map how far the unexplored passages run and where that rising current of cold air is actually coming from. None of this requires exotic technology or an enormous budget. It requires an institution willing to make the climb, and so far, none has. Until then, what exists is a short list of hard facts and a much longer list of open questions. There is a hall carved or built more than 30 meters underground on a remote Russian summit, lined with stones heavier than anything moved to build the Great Pyramid, fitted at right angles that volcanic rock does not produce on its own, sitting in a region where humans have been cutting into stone for at least 5,000 years. Nobody left a single trace of using it. Cold air still rises from somewhere below that no rope has ever reached. And the mountain that holds it all keeps its answer exactly where it's always been, in the dark, waiting for someone to go back down and look.